let's start with evolution and defining it. It can be defined as change in the properties of groups of organisms over the course of generations. So what does it mean? First, we have a population here. It's made of individuals. Each of these circles are an individual. And one important thing in evolution is heritability. So you need to have the chain of generations, that you need to move to transmit the genetic material from one generation to the following. But as you can see, if there's only heritability, all the individuals look the same, and that's not, of course, how the real life is. But there's also variation. And including variation, it makes already the situation look a lot more realistic. And then now, this variation is then transmitted to the following generation. But that's not all, because there needs to be also the change-causing forces. Because as that is the case, that the variation which exists is not always transmitted to the following generation in the similar way, but there are forces which make it so that in the population some phenotypes or features, characteristics are more frequent, like in here the darker blue colors compared to the light blue ones. So they've increased in the frequency in that population. So these are the main three focal parts of evolution. And now let's see how these parallel with species and the genetic data or genetic material where it's usually used or considered the evolution works, and then with language data or linguistic material. Okay, the heritability part. There is transmission of genes from one generation to another, parents till offspring, the basic mechanism how it goes. But there is also transmission of genetic material within one generation. That's not as common as the vertical transmission, but it also takes place, for example, in bacteria. Then with languages, there is again transmission from one generation to another, parents till children, but also, and perhaps in a lot more broadly than with genetic material, there is also transmission within one generation from the peers of from the same generation of the language speaker. And these mechanisms in which these are transmitted in these two fields are in genetic material, these are these genetic mechanisms, to say it broadly, and with languages it's learning and imitation. All right, variation. As we saw, there is variation, and when there's little amount of variation, these different individuals are considered to belong to the same species, but different populations in it. But if there's lot amount of variation between these groups, they are considered to belong to different species. Similarly, with languages, if there's small amount of differences between populations or dialects, they still belong to the same language, but when there's more of those differences, they belong to different languages. Again, there are mechanisms which produce variation, and with genetic data, it's mutations, and then with language data, it's innovations and errors in transmission. Then about the change-causing forces. Drift takes place in both, and it means that there are, in both of these, both with language and genetic material, these random changes that you cannot predict or say which feature or which variant will increase in future, but it's random. But in addition to that, there is also selection in both of these. But the nature of the selection is a bit different in these. With genetic data and biological species, adaptation works through selection. But then with languages, there is this component of decision which is possible to exist, even though there may be some sort of adaptation also with language data and linguistic material, but there is still the possibility of having a decision with language data, which is something that doesn't exist with species and with genetic material, because it only takes place if there's selection, it takes place through adaptation. So we can conclude from here that the main parts, these three focal parts of evolution, are the same with genetic material and species and linguistic material and languages, but then the intentionality is the biggest thing that separates these two. And another place where this intentionality is included is in these innovations, because there's a need to invent a new term or word for some meaning, you really can use intentionality and like decide what you're going to say, instead of that it would be the word that would like adapt to this or suit to the situation the best. All right, let's add up one more term from the title. So what is language evolution? And when I did my PhD studies, of course, I thought that there's only one way of like understanding what it means. But then I noted that, yeah, it's really something that you should point out that like which sort of language evolution you're talking about, because it can, when you just combine language and evolution, different people think it different way. So first, some people think that it's the evolution of human language. How has it evolved? Which are the genetic differences, for example, what we have compared to chimpanzees, that has it made it possible that we have language as we have it now. Then another thing is the emergence of then the communication system. How that from a point where there is no system, or the system is very simple, that how has it turned into way to that kind of a complex system what we have now? How has it taken place? Then the third way of understanding language evolution is to apply these evolutionary models to explain language change. Meaning that you take very carefully these analogies like which I explained earlier, like for example the replicator selection, that different linguistic variants have different, or they have different weight, or other one are selected because they are considered better, and that's considered to induce language change. That's like taking more the evolutionary models directly to the study of language change and explaining the language change, that how language changes in time with those evolutionary models. Then there is a way of using evolutionary methods used in biology, to study language-related questions and to apply to language data. And for example, you can use these phylogenetic methods with which you can draw these trees used in biology to make species trees, to make these language trees like here. And then you can take these population genetic methods then to analyze dialect data, for example. And then the final one which I want to mention here is taking a step further from the evolutionary biology methods to the whole evolutionary biology framework and applying that to language-related questions, meaning that as there is a way or like convention how to study, for example, species divergence in biology, then to apply that whole framework to study how languages have diverged. And actually these two things are the ones I've been studying doing my PhD and working still now. And naturally this is something I will then explain further, or part of this now. And then the aim in this, like why to apply methodology from a totally different field, from biology to study language. Then the big aim here is very modestly to study the global history of human. But of course there are many and even more steps need to be taken that before that stage can be reached. But then of course you need to start from somewhere. Of course first you need to have the data, and then you need to test that okay, you have these biological methods and the data, whether these methods work. After that you can apply the framework and see what it results with. And then you can get some kind of a view of the history of Finnish language. But then this is still focusing only on the language, and then comes the interesting part of combining this language-related data on like information of archaeology, genetics, cultural environment, so that you can get some kind of multidisciplinary view of the history of Finland. And of course, Finland is a very small part of the globe, So this needs to be, of course, broadened a lot. And then, for example, the next level what we can study is the multidisciplinary history, or then the linguistic history of the Uralic speaker area. And this is just in principle the way that how from these different small parts, the huge puzzle of the global history of human we are trying to build here. And even though it looks quite sad, thinking about the big goal here, but this is the place we have been now. But we think that this is very important to work properly, like validating the biological method, that then when we finally get into these parts, we know that the basics are done properly and okay. And this is something of which I'll present to you today. And more precisely, I will present how we've applied this population genetic clustering method with Finnish dialect data. All right. And I'll start with the language data, which is the Dialect Atlas of Finnish, because that's the main reason why we are able to study it. The data was collected by Professor Lauri Kettunen, and the atlas was published in 1940s, and this is how close I've got to Kettunen, unfortunately, but this is already something. And so the data was collected in the 1920s and 30s, which means that the data, language data what we have, is nearly 100 years old. So it doesn't represent the linguistic situation of today, but pretty much of what it was in the beginning of the 20th century. How the data was collected has been mainly documented only in his traveling memoirs here. And in principle, or how he did the data collection was that he took his sidecar, motorcycle, and then a car, and then went around Finland to collect data, ask informants how do they say certain variants or like certain words and so on. But in addition that he went to people's homes, he also went to prisons and houses for poor and old and sick people, because in those places he could get more informants from the same location. But even in these places he was very careful to select old and uneducated people to get the purest form of the local dialect. And as you can see, these are pictures from the traveling memoirs, that from some of these there is like age mentioned, but not all of them, and there is not information of all the informants, of course, but it's like you get some kind of idea how the data was collected. And the map or the atlas has this kind of map sheets. And there is in total 213 of these, and there is in total data of 525 municipalities, so it's quite a broad data. There is various lexical features or linguistic features, such as different lexical features, different words, and different ways to say different words. For example, and then also morphological and phonological features. And of course, this is the atlas, but it really needs to be turned into numbers that we can analyze it with these quantitative methods. And it was originally done by these researchers in York University, Canada, and the Institute for the Languages of Finland. But after that, we fixed and went through the data, so it was okay for us to use it. So let's zoom in a bit to see what there is actually in the map. In here you have Suomussalmi, and when you check from the explanatory panel, you see that, okay, that in the map number 8, it's how you say metsä and metsän. And as you can see, there are different variants, but all the informants in Suomussalmi have said that they say mehtä, metän. Then comparing how the informants have said that in Pielavesi, there is a more variation, because they've said also this with this horizontal line that mehtä, metän, but also some informants have said that the correct way of saying, or they would say like as mehtä, mehän. And then how this was turned into new numbers is that very simply, as you saw, these are here, and then just counting from the top of the explanatory panel and putting that into Excel sheet. So as this is from the 13th and this is from the 14th box, we put that with the map number column there. So in principle, the data looks that in the first column there is all the municipalities, 525, and all in the different columns there is the different map sheets, and then the numbers in which according to those boxes in the explanatory panel. And one thing to point or note also from this is that with this kind of coding and with the methods what we want to use, it's possible to take into account the variation within a municipality into account. Because often in the analysis, in the quantitative analysis, you're able to choose to take the one column here, but as you see that there is like a variation within municipalities also existing linguistically, this way it's also possible to take it into account in the analysis. And we think this is a great asset to have here. And then, okay, why to study Finnish dialects and how they, whether they can be studied with this quantitative method, is that, well, first, we have the great data, and second, it has been studied very well with traditional linguistic methods. So we know pretty much what we should find there. Here are a few examples of the traditional dialect divisions, and then in addition, Finnish dialects have also been earlier analyzed with these quantitative distance-based methods. But then the thing what we want to test is this model-based method, which is the one used in population genetics. And we did it so that we made the analysis also with this distance-based method called k-medoids. And as it's distance-based, it doesn't have any model. And it means that each of the individuals or municipalities, which is now as our study unit, the origins of each municipality can come only from one population. And there is no assumptions with this distance-based method. So we use this as a comparison that whether this model-based method really works. And the model-based method what we used is called structure. And as I said, it's used in population genetics to cluster genetic data into populations. And it uses this so-called admixture model, which makes it possible that each individual, or like genetic individual, but if we're speaking now about the linguistic data, so each municipality can have origins in several different ancestral dialects, so to say. But the thing is that as this is a model-based and it's made for the genetic data, it has these certain biological assumptions. And these are especially the reason why we need to study whether the result, what it produces, makes any sense. That we don't just use it and say that it's okay, even though we are not sure of it. And one assumption is, for example, the independence of different linguistic features what we study, even though that's something that should be always taken care of. But here, with this model-based method structure, it's explicitly said that this is something you should check first. And then, in principle, the testing of the method and validation of it was done that we did these two analyses, distance-based and model-based, and then compared all the results with each other to see whether they match or not. But first here about testing the traits, or testing the method and of the independence of the traits. First, here is a histogram of how much in the data different map sheets, which are now the traits, are linked or dependent on each other. And the more there is red, the more they are linked. And I don't know whether you can see the line, but it goes like this. So there is only quite a small fraction which are very strongly linked with each other, which was a good result. And in this heat plot, you can see all the different map sheets, 213, this way and this way, to compare it with each other and to see whether they are correlating or linked with each other a lot or not. And as you can see also related to this, majority of it is yellow, which is a good thing that they are not linked. And even though there are some red areas, then it's that we know that there is some like things you need to maybe take into account. And then these may be taken away in the certain analysis if one wishes so, but in this case we used the whole data as a full. And so here are now, I'll show now the dialect areas and their comparisons, but here is just to show that this is what I meant, that origins can be only on one population. Here is the southwestern dialect, and each of these municipalities are equally red. Instead, in this structure, which was the model-based and what we were testing whether it works, it has this color of darker red and then the lighter red, if you can see it. So it means that with this model-based method, we're able to distinguish the core dialect area and then the transitional dialect area, which is then colored here with a paler shade, which is then again a more natural way of perhaps representing like linguistic variation, because the dialect borders don't change like sharply as they appear in here. But it's just that this model, or like this method doesn't allow this kind of a variation in the per each municipality. Okay, and now when comparing these different dialect areas and what appear in different maps, or like this is the traditional and then the model-based and distance-based, we see that they match very nicely. The only difference, or the biggest difference, is with the Hamed dialects. So in the traditional view, it's considered as a large, big area, but both in the quantitative analysis, they split, so the southwest Hame separates from the other Hame area, but here then the transitional dialects appear also. But this is not something that we are too much worried, because this is an area which is also noted in linguistic literature that it really is quite different. And that also in other analyses, if we increase the number of populations or dialects what we produce, this dialect or transitional dialects also appear. And most importantly, these were quantitative methods both, and this didn't have assumptions, and this did, and they produced pretty much the same results. So we think, or considering this, we think that the results are okay and the method is applicable. Okay, so what? We made dialect areas. Other people have made dialect areas also earlier. But so as I said, this was just a starting point, validating the method. And next we can, for example, divide the dialect data into more dialects or more clusters, and then take away the transitional areas like it has been taken away. So only the core areas of dialects are colored here. And also we've lost parts of the maps. But it can also be done. But then the main thing what can be followed from this, that we can, for example, calculate linguistic distances between different dialect areas. And it means that, for example, by using this FST method, which is also used in population genetics, to measure how different populations are genetically from each other, we can use that to measure how different these dialects are from each other. And for example, the smaller the value, the closer the dialects, or the more similar the dialects are with each other. And here is an example of one of the smallest value, which is between southwestern transitional and then southwest dialects, red and green. And okay, yeah, it's not surprising, they are very close to each other and they are quite alike, and not all even agree whether they should be separated or not. But then comparing, for example, this black area, which is part of Savo dialects, and then southern Ostrobothnia here, this is like one of the biggest or largest differences between dialects. And of course the surprising thing, or in a way, is that even though they are geographically very close, they are so linguistically different from each other. And this is the way to quantify that. But okay, so what now? We have linguistic distances. But this makes it possible that we can compare these distances, for example, with geographical distances, and then differences in environmental and cultural conditions, which makes it possible to study then the drivers of linguistic divergence. That why are there dialects? What explains them? And this is already like a step further, like applying the biological framework, that whether this idea how these species diverge can be applied to study how languages diverge. And the take-home message is pretty much in here. First, quantitative methods. They allow objective analysis of large data sets. As you saw, the Kettunen dataset itself is very big, and it's just the fact that your own brain capacity is not enough to analyze the data in the same way as computer does. And that way you're, for example, able to do this quantitative dialect division. But then one thing to remember is that even though we're biologists playing with language data, it's very important to remember that the language data what we use is highly dependent on the linguists who've been collecting the data and what they can, what for example features they've chosen to be studied. Because we are just playing and working with the data what the linguists have made for us. So this definitely cannot be done only by biologists, but this needs to be a collaboration between linguists and biologists to do it in a credible way. Then the biological approach brings the possibility that we can study both old and new questions from new perspective. And with that I mean, for example, that to study the biological context of linguistic divergence. And I think that as many of these questions have been studied in biology quantitatively, and there's an existing framework how to do it, then why not to apply that also to language data, which is it has so many similarities and spoken by humans, and in that way it could be used there. So together these quantitative methods and biological approach could bring the possibility to squeeze vast amount of linguistic information into numbers, making the quantitative comparison then with genetic and cultural and ecological data sets possible. And then this makes it possible to ask questions that are not anymore only related on the linguistic history, but more broadly to the history of human. Even though I'm the one speaking here, there's still many people involved in this business. I'm working in this Bedlam project, and there are linguists and biologists in the universities of Tampere, Turku and Helsinki, and Institute for the Languages of Finland is also working, or we are collaborating with them. And we've got funding, which is always very nice and helps in doing research. And I would also like to thank you for your attention.